The rain came down hard over the outskirts of Washington that evening, drumming on rooftops and turning the parking lot of a small grocery store into a shimmering plain of black water. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a tired white glow, and the air smelled of damp cardboard and floor cleaner. A handful of late shoppers wandered the narrow aisles, none of them paying much attention to anyone else. Zane Mercer pushed open the glass door with his shoulder, holding the small hand of his 6-year-old daughter Matilda. He was 29, tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair cut close and a quiet, weathered look that came from carrying too much by himself for too long. His work jacket was scuffed, and a thin scratch ran across the back of his right hand from a sliding door he had repaired that day at a neighborhood pharmacy. Matilda walked beside him in a faded pink coat, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to the mother she barely remembered. He moved down the aisle with the careful pace of a man counting every dollar. A half-gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a small box of crackers. Matilda reached for a brightly colored box of cereal and looked up at him with hopeful eyes, but he gently shook his head and placed it back on the shelf. He told her the weekend was only 2 days away. She nodded and slipped her free hand into his jacket pocket. At the front of the store, an old man stood at the only open register. He was 91 years old, his shoulders narrow and bowed, his gray wool cap pulled low against the chill that hung in the doorway. His name was William Harlantot. On the counter in front of him sat a small stack of items: a loaf of bread, a quart of milk, a can of soup, a small bottle of heart medication, and a single can of cat food. The cashier, a young woman barely out of high school, swiped his card a second time. The screen blinked the same red word it had blinked the first: declined. William's hands trembled as he opened his wallet. He apologized in a low voice and said the bank must have made another mistake. The cashier offered, kindly, to set a few items aside. He looked at the bottle of heart medication for a long moment. He did not put back the medication. He did not put back the food. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and lifted out a small velvet box, worn at the corners, but cared for as if it were holy. He opened it slowly, and inside lay a tarnished medal on a faded ribbon. He asked the cashier, almost in a whisper, if she could hold it for him until Friday. He said he only needed the medicine and the bread for tonight. For a moment, the store seemed to hold its breath. To most of the shoppers, it was simply an old piece of metal. But Zane, who had spent 6 years in uniform before life took a different shape, knew exactly what such a medal cost a man, and he knew that no soldier ever set such a thing on a counter, the way one might set down a coin. Matilda tugged her father's sleeve and asked, in the soft voice of a child who already sensed something wrong, whether the man at the counter was a hero. Zane did not answer her right away. He looked at the medal, then at the deep flush of shame on William's face, and felt something tighten in his chest he had not felt in a long time. A new figure stepped forward from beside the candy display. He was a man in his mid-50s, in an expensive leather jacket, with a handshake of a smile, and a voice that sounded friendly, only because it had been practiced for years. His name was Otis Granger. He owned an antique shop 2 streets over and called himself a collector of war memorabilia. He picked up the medal as if it were a paperweight, examined it for less than 5 seconds, and offered William $75 in cash on the spot. He told the old man that at his age he needed his medicine more than he needed a memory. William did not push back. He was too tired, too embarrassed, and too used to being told what he ought to need. Matilda watched her father's face, uncertain. Zane stepped past Otis without a word and laid 2 folded 20s and a 5 on the counter. He told the cashier to ring up everything the old man had brought, including the cat food. Otis turned, irritated, and asked who Zane thought he was to interrupt. Zane did not raise his voice. He looked at the medal in Otis's hand and said that a thing like that was not bought with the price of a single dinner. As William tucked the receipt and a folded bank statement into his coat, a single envelope fluttered to the floor. Zane bent and picked it up. He saw the embossed letterhead of Caldwell Legacy Capital, and just below it, in plain typewritten text, a line that read Meridian Harbor Holdings, Legacy Adjustment, $248. Zane said nothing about it. But the soft fatigue in his eyes shifted into something harder. He understood, in that moment, that this was not simply an old man short on cash. Someone, somewhere, was draining him. At that moment, the front doors hissed open again, and a woman stepped in from the rain. She was 28 years old, her chestnut hair loose over a black tailored blazer, a cream-colored dress beneath. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet tile, her presence entirely out of place against the dim aisles. Her name was Serafina Caldwell, and her assistant Audrey Pierce walked a half-step behind her, phone pressed to her ear. They had not planned to be there. Their car had stalled 3 blocks away, and Audrey had hurried in for emergency supplies before they continued to a charity gala that Serafina's company was hosting that night. It carried the title Protecting Those Who Served, and Serafina was the keynote speaker. She heard her own company's name spoken near the register and stopped at once. Her eyes traveled in a single calm sweep across the scene, taking in Zane's worn jacket, Matilda's stuffed rabbit, the trembling hands of the old man, the medal on the counter, and the bank statement still in Zane's grip. She drew her conclusions in less than 3 seconds, and almost all of them were wrong. She approached briskly and asked Zane why he was holding the personal documents of a Caldwell legacy client. Zane explained, quietly, that the man's card had been declined and that there were unusual fees on his statement. He did not raise his voice, and he did not explain who he was or where he had once worked. Serafina did not hear his words with compassion. She heard them with the reflex of a chief executive trained to manage risk before pity. She told him that all client matters were handled through proper channels, and that no outsider had any standing to intervene. Zane asked her if she knew William personally. She glanced at the name on the envelope, and answered that he was a senior heritage client, managed by one of her directors. If there had been a billing error, she said, the firm would address it during business hours. To her, this was a service delay. To Zane, this was a 91-year-old man placing a medal on a counter to buy heart medicine. Otis chimed in, eager to muddy the water. He told Serafina that Zane was making a scene over a sale that the old man had agreed to himself. Serafina did not defend Otis, but she wanted the disturbance ended quickly, and so she turned to Zane and said in a voice as cool as polished glass that he was a maintenance worker, not a financial expert. Zane did not flinch. He said that he did not need to be a financial expert to know that a man of 91 should not be hungry while a company like hers collected fees from him every month. For the briefest second, Serafina hesitated. But pride is a stubborn thing in those who have only just earned the right to wear it, and she pressed on. She handed William a business card, told him to call her office in the morning, and warned Zane not to retain any copy of the client's documents. As she turned to leave, Matilda's small voice followed her. The little girl asked, plainly and without anger, why a man who had served his country was hungry if Serafina's company was supposed to help old soldiers. Serafina paused for one full beat. She looked at Audrey. Then she walked out into the rain without answering. Zane drove William home through streets slick with rain. The old man rode in the passenger seat with both hands wrapped around his velvet box, and Matilda sat quietly in the back, watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. No one spoke. The silence was thick with the kind of weight words would only have cheapened. William's house sat at the end of a tired side street where the porches sagged and the mailboxes leaned. Inside, the small living room was clean but plainly poor. A faded recliner faced an old television. The radiator clicked weakly. On the mantel sat photographs of a young soldier in dress uniform, a wedding portrait turned brown at the edges, and a folded flag in a glass case. The picture said clearly that William had not let himself go. He had simply been pushed, slowly and quietly, past the point where he could keep up. Matilda noticed the empty refrigerator first. Without saying a word, she walked the loaf of bread her father had bought to the kitchen counter and slid it toward William. The old man's eyes shone, but he forced a smile, and called her his little soldier. Zane helped him sort his medications and saw that several prescriptions had not been filled because there had been no money left at the end of the month. William explained, slowly, that his pension had once been enough, but somewhere over the past few years, things had begun to vanish in small bites that he could never quite track. After his wife had passed, a financial advisor named Clinton Vale had offered to help him hold on to his home, manage his end-of-life expenses, and protect his savings. He had signed papers he had not entirely understood because the firm had a good name and the man had a soft voice. Zane asked gently if he could look at the statements. William hesitated. He did not want a younger man to see how badly he had failed at his own life. But Matilda touched the framed photograph of her host in his old uniform and asked what the medal had been given for. He told her in a slow and steady voice about a battlefield and a friend who had pulled him to safety and never come back. He said he had carried the medal because he was, in some quiet way, living for two. When he finished, Zane looked through the bank statements and saw the pattern. Small charges, repeated month after month, dressed in different names. $49, $87, $119, $248. Legacy adjustment. Preservation review.u. Senior asset support. Estate continuity fee. All of them tied, when followed back, to the same shell company called Meridian Harbor Holdings. When Zane drove Matilda home that night, she asked him quietly whether someone had been stealing from the old man. Zane watched the wipers cut steadily through the rain and answered that he did not know yet. But he said that if someone had been, they had picked the wrong veteran to rob. In the days that followed, Zane lived two lives. By daylight, he repaired security panels and automatic doors at the chain of pharmacies and groceries that paid his bills. By night, after Matilda was asleep, he sat at the small kitchen table with his old laptop, a cooling cup of coffee, and the careful copies of William's statements. He moved through public business filings and payment processor records, the way a man moves through a familiar dark room. Meridian Harbor Holdings, he discovered, had been registered in Delaware. Its listed address was a virtual office. It had no website, no public employees, and no clear line of business. The amounts withdrawn from William's account were carefully shaped to slip beneath the automatic alerts most banks set for elderly clients. None were large enough to trigger a flag. All were irregular enough to add up. He called Henry Barlow, an old friend from his unit who had become an independent auditor since they had left the service. Henry warned him at first to be careful. Going up against a firm the size of Caldwell Legacy was a way to lose what little he had. But when Zane told him about the medal and the heart medication left behind, Henry went quiet for a long time. Then he said he was in. Henry confirmed the pattern within 48 hours. He called it a slow bleed. The fees were not designed to rob a man at once, but to drain him over years in amounts so small he would only notice them as a vague feeling that life had become harder than it should have been. Zane went back to William's house and asked, very gently, if he knew of other older veterans who had been clients of Clinton Vale. William remembered 3 names from a financial planning seminar he had attended after his wife had died. A retired Korean War rifleman in a nursing home, the widow of a Navy chief, a former Air Force pilot in his 90s. Each of them had walked out of that seminar with the same firm handshake and the same soft promise to keep them safe in their final years. Zane reached out to each of them carefully, by mail and by phone, with no pressure. Some did not answer. One hung up in shame. One wept softly when she heard Clinton Vale's name. 3 of them eventually gave signed permission to review their statements. The pattern was the same. Always Meridian Harbor. Always slow. Otis Granger continued to circle. He called William twice more, raising his offer to $100 and then to $150, warning that medication did not pay for itself. Zane was at the house during one of those calls, and though he could not yet prove the threat, he wrote down the time, the number, and every word. Henry called him late one night with a tightness in his voice that Zane had not heard since their final deployment. He said he'd now identified 4 more victims tied to the same advisor in the same shell. He said the total was no longer in the thousands. It might already be in the millions. Zane looked over at Matilda asleep on the couch, the stuffed rabbit pressed to her cheek, and he understood that from this point forward he was no longer helping a single old man. He was facing a system. Inside Caldwell Legacy Capital, Clinton Vale began to feel the first cool draft of trouble. He did not panic. Panic was for amateurs. He walked into Serafina's office one bright midweek morning and explained, in the patient voice of a man who only wanted to protect the firm, that a maintenance worker named Zane Mercer had been approaching elderly clients, photographing their statements, and planting suspicion. He suggested, with regret, that Mercer might be a struggling single father with a military record looking for a payout or a public spectacle. Serafina remembered the rain, the metal, the scratch on Zane's hand, and Matilda's question. But she also remembered that her firm was about to close a major contract with a statewide veterans fund, and that even a hint of scandal could turn that contract into ash. She authorized the legal department to send Zane a cease and desist letter warning him to stop contacting Caldwell clients and to destroy any copies of their records, or face suit for invasion of privacy. The letter arrived at Zane's workplace the next afternoon. His supervisor took him aside in the parking lot and said that Caldwell Legacy was a prospective client for the security maintenance contract, and that until the matter was resolved, Zane's hours would have to be cut. The blow was almost surgical in its cruelty. The strong did not need to swing fists. They only needed to take a man's hours. That night, Zane sat in his old pickup outside Matilda's school with the engine off and the rain ticking on the roof. Matilda climbed into the passenger seat and asked, with a child's clear instinct, whether they were in trouble because of William. Zane managed a tired smile and told her it was not because of William. It was because some people did not like to be asked the right questions. Matilda pressed her stuffed rabbit into his hand for a moment, the way children sometimes share their courage. In her glass office downtown, Serafina watched a video clip that Audrey had quietly pulled from the grocery store's security system. She watched Zane lay his money on the counter. She watched Matilda push the loaf of bread toward William. She watched Otis lift the metal. And she watched herself, in cool heels and a tailored blazer, speak to a man she now knew nothing about. For the first time in a long time, she did not like what she saw. She did not change sides yet, but she dialed Zane's number, telling him to meet her alone at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. If he had evidence, he should bring it. If not, the matter would end the next day. The coffee shop sat on a corner of polished glass and pale stone, the kind of place where executives ordered single shots of espresso between meetings. Serafina arrived first in an ivory dress and black blazer, the picture of perfect command. Zane arrived a few minutes after, in a clean shirt and his old work jacket, carrying only a brown manila folder. She began the way she had been trained to begin. She told him that she understood emotions could run high when one saw a client struggle, but that emotions did not replace process, and if he was personally in financial difficulty, she could direct him to a charitable program. The kindness in her voice did not entirely hide the assumption beneath it. Zane did not answer the assumption. He opened the folder and laid William's statement on the table. He pointed to each highlighted line. Then he laid down 2 more statements, with personal information redacted, that he had received with permission from 2 other elderly clients. He showed her how the same fees, dressed in different names, appeared on the same dates of the month, all routed through the same shell. Serafina said the fees might be legitimate. Zane asked her where the service contract for Meridian Harbor was filed. She said her firm had hundreds of vendors. He said that meant she was collecting money from elderly clients through vendors she could not even name. The point landed quietly but heavily. Serafina was a chief executive, but she had not been looking down at her own operations as carefully as she had imagined. Zane went on. He showed her that Clinton Vale's signature, or approval code, appeared on every relevant document. She bristled at the mention of Clinton. He had brought serious revenue into the senior accounts division. Zane answered that the revenue might well be the medication, the food and the home repairs of men like William. She asked him, finally, what he wanted. Money, a settlement, a position at the firm. Zane reached into his jacket pocket and drew out a small stuffed rabbit. He set it carefully on the table between them. He explained, with a faint smile, that his daughter had slipped it into his pocket that morning, so he would not forget about William. He looked at it for a moment. Then he met Serafina's eyes, and said that what he wanted was for his little girl to grow up in a country where a man who had served did not have to sell his mettle for medicine. Serafina did not answer at once. For perhaps the first time in her career, she found herself sitting across from a person who had no public relations strategy, no attorney, and no demand. He had only a question, and the question was older than her firm. He finished by saying that he did not have all the data. She did. If he was wrong, she could prove it inside an hour. If he was right, every minute she waited was another month of medication taken from another old man. She left the coffee shop without an apology. But that night she called Audrey and told her to open a confidential internal review of Meridian Harbor Holdings. Audrey asked carefully whether they should inform Clinton. Serafina looked down at the file on her desk and said no. If he was innocent, he did not need to be warned. If he was guilty, all the more reason he should not. Audrey worked through the night. The data was not easy. Meridian Harbor did not appear as a primary vendor. Its fees were buried under a dozen different category names so that no single report would draw attention to them. But Audrey was patient. She matched approval codes, sub-account numbers, and electronic signatures. They all came back to the same name: Clinton Vale. Serafina sat in her glass office while the city blinked beneath her, and the names rose on her screen one at a time. William Harlan, 91. An 88-year-old veteran in a nursing home. The 84-year-old widow of a Navy lieutenant, a 93-year-old former Air Force pilot, die. In all there were 14 names, every one of them past 80, every one of them living alone, every one of them connected to military service. The total losses, traced over 5 years of small and patient withdrawals, came to $2.1 million. For Serafina, the figure was not the worst part. The worst part was that the firm she had built her own image upon had become a slow, quiet machine for taking from those it claimed to protect. She had believed her company gave the elderly safety. She now saw that it had given them an arrangement. Meanwhile, Zane and Henry pursued the second thread. They visited the antique shop owned by Otis Granger and noticed, through the locked glass cases, items that should not have been there. A dress watch engraved with a soldier's initials. A field journal with a familiar last name. Letters in a thin hand from the front lines of a war long since closed. They could not seize anything, but Zane photographed each piece through the glass and recorded the catalog numbers. When he showed William some of those photographs, the old man recognized the watch as one that had belonged to a friend of his, who had once told him through tears that he had sold it to repair a leaking roof. The crime, Zane realized, was not only financial. It was the careful theft of memory. Serafina called Zane at midnight. The cool tone was gone from her voice. She told him simply that he was right. But she also told him that if they moved without care, Clinton would erase data, blame an underling, and let the firm fall apart before any victim ever recovered a dime. Zane did not gloat. He understood the danger. He told her they needed to lock the data, freeze his access by the next morning, gather sworn statements, and force Clinton to expose himself in his own words. From that night forward, Serafina and Zane worked as unwilling allies. There was no romance in it. There was a hard, quiet respect between two people who had finally agreed that the truth was larger than either of their pride. In a corner office on the floor below, Clinton Vale's screen blinked with an alert he had not expected. There had been an unusual access query into the older accounts. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked up his phone and called Otis Granger. He asked, with the calm of a man already reaching for the next play, whether the old Harlan had sold the medal yet. The plan they made was not illegal. Serafina had every right to summon an internal audit and call her own director into a meeting. William had every right to bring an advocate when his file was discussed. Zane did not break in, did not impersonate, and did not steal. They moved on facts, on consent, and on the chief executive's lawful authority. Serafina arranged a closed meeting under the cover of a so-called crisis review of the William Harlan account ahead of the upcoming Veterans Gala. Clinton, believing that her priorities were still public relations and damage control, stepped easily into the room with a folder of pre-prepared paperwork. Before the meeting, Zane drove to William's house. The old man was scared. He told Zane that he had lived through a war, but that now, somehow, he was afraid of a financial office. Zane did not push. He said that if William did not want to come, they would find another way. But William looked down at his medal, opened the velvet box, and said quietly that he had not kept the thing for 90 years to fall silent in front of a man in a suit. Matilda was there too. She slipped her father a small folded piece of paper that she had drawn herself. On it, she had crayoned a clumsy outline of a medal and had written in careful, misshapen letters the words, "You are still brave." William put the note inside his coat pocket, where it would sit just above his heart. The meeting was held in the marble-lined conference room of Caldwell Legacy Capital. Serafina sat at the head of the long table with Audrey beside her. Clinton sat across from William in a charcoal suit and a tie too expensive for the room. Zane stood beside William, not speaking, while the old man took his seat with both hands flat on the polished wood. Serafina opened the meeting by feigning concern about Zane's behavior. Clinton seized the moment and slid a one-page document across the table. He asked William to sign a brief acknowledgement that he had not been harmed, that all fees had been properly disclosed, and that an outside party had unduly influenced him. He added, almost in passing, that certain provisions of the reverse mortgage William had signed could be triggered if matters were not promptly settled, and that the old man's house could face risk through the winter. It was the moment Clinton revealed himself. He had used the fear of losing a home to push a 91-year-old veteran into silence. Zane asked, without raising his voice, what services Meridian Harbor Holdings provided to William. Clinton answered, vaguely, that the firm offered legacy management support. Zane asked who performed that work. He asked for the office address, the staff names, the direct phone line. Clinton bristled. He turned to Serafina and said that a maintenance worker had no business interrogating a senior director. The slur was the same one Serafina herself had used in the grocery store weeks before. This time, she did not stand with him. Serafina laid down the list of 14 names. Audrey projected the cash flow chart onto the screen on the wall. Henry, joining by video link as an independent auditor, confirmed that every fee traveled through the same shell and that the structure showed all the hallmarks of organized financial elder abuse. Clinton changed his face. He warned Serafina that a public revelation would lose the firm its contract, cost employees their jobs, and bring her own signature into a shareholder lawsuit. He told her, with quiet venom, that she had personally signed the division's profit reports. She could not stand outside this. She looked at William. She looked at Zane. Through the glass wall behind him, she saw Matilda waiting in the small reception lounge, a stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. Serafina spoke slowly, each word measured. If a company had to live on the medication money of old men, she said, then it did not deserve to live. Clinton's face hardened. He did not surrender easily. Within minutes, he had reached his contacts in the legal department, accusing Zane of unauthorized access to client information and the manipulation of an elderly party. He pressed a button beneath the table and asked security to escort the visitor from the building. 2 uniformed guards entered the room. Zane did not resist. He knew that any heated reaction would be turned against him by the end of the hour. Matilda watched through the glass with wide eyes as the guards approached her father. Serafina rose to intervene, but Clinton spoke first, loudly, so that every staff member in the corridor could hear. He told her she was about to let a poor single father destroy the company her father had left her. He aimed at her pride and at her family name, the way a knife is aimed. Zane laid one final envelope on the table. Inside was a recording, made by William himself with full consent, of a phone call in which Clinton had told the old man that if he failed to sell a few keepsakes and signed certain papers, his house might not be safe through the winter. The phrasing was careful enough that Clinton had believed himself protected. It was clear enough now to choke him. William stood. His hands trembled, but his eyes were steady. He took the velvet box from his coat, opened it, and set the metal in the center of the long table. The room fell silent. He spoke not loudly, but with a quiet that traveled. He said he had carried the metal through a war. He had kept it the night his wife had died. He had kept it as friend after friend had gone before him. But he had nearly lost it, he said, in an air-conditioned office, because a man in a suit had told him he no longer had a choice. The line cracked something in the room that no chart had cracked. The staff outside the glass door understood, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a matter of legal exposure. It was a matter of betrayal. Serafina ordered the guards to step back. She suspended Clinton Vale on the spot, sealed his access, and instructed Audrey to deliver the full data set to outside counsel and to the appropriate authorities. Clinton lost his composure for the first time and threw a few sharp words at her on the way out. They did not matter. He had already shown his face. Across town, on the strength of Zane's photographs, sworn statements from victims, and the records of Meridian Harbor's withdrawals, investigators visited Otis Granger's antique shop. He played innocent at first, claiming all sales had been voluntary. But Zane had noticed on his earlier visit that a wooden cabinet behind the counter had fresh screws of a slightly different color. When the cabinet was opened, a hidden compartment revealed a small notebook listing the names of veterans, their health conditions, the items in their possession, and the prices Otis intended to push. The most chilling notes read lives alone, children far away, will need money for medication, easier to convince after the 15th. The thefts had not been random. They had been hunted. Before the press, Serafina did not place all blame on Clinton. She admitted that the firm she led had failed in oversight, and she pledged that every dollar would be returned. She added one sentence that traveled further than any other. "The first person to see the truth," she said, "was not me. It was a father buying milk for his daughter on a rainy night." In the weeks that followed, the firm convened an emergency restitution fund. The 14 affected families received the money that had been stolen, with additional damages. But Zane reminded everyone that the loss had never been only financial. There had been missed medications, unrepaired roofs, and a kind of trust that does not return a check. Caldwell Legacy paid to repair William's roof, settled his outstanding medical bills, and bought back as many of the stolen keepsakes as the auctioneers could trace. Some pieces were never recovered. That was the honest face of justice. It could begin to mend, but it could not undo. Serafina visited William's home without cameras and without a press team. She wore a plain gray coat and tied her hair back in a low knot. Her face looked older than it had in the boardroom. She apologized to him directly. He did not forgive her easily. He told her, in a voice quiet but unsoftened, that she had not stolen the money herself, but that she had sat in the chair where she could have seen, and she had chosen not to look. Serafina did not flinch. She agreed with him, fully. She said she would not ask him to forget. She would only ask for the chance to repair what could still be repaired. Zane stood by the door without speaking. He understood that this moment was not his to fill. Several months passed. Clinton Vale was indicted on multiple counts. Otis Granger lost his shop and faced charges of defrauding elderly veterans. Meridian Harbor Holdings was dissolved. But the story did not end with punishment. Serafina stepped down from several honorary positions, accepted independent oversight, and worked with Zane, Henry, and Audrey to found a small nonprofit that offered free financial review for elderly veterans, the surviving spouses of service members, and seniors living alone. The organization promised one simple thing, that no person of age would be made to sign what they could not understand. Zane finally accepted a part-time role overseeing case review and emergency outreach, on his own conditions. No use of Matilda's image. No sealing of Caldwell's old failures. Every report written in language an old veteran could read. The closing gathering was held at a small community hall, not at a marble gala. On the wall hung a single line that read, "No one who served should have to stand alone." William looked stronger. His house had been mended, his metal returned to its glass case. He pinned a small unit pin, not the medal itself, onto Matilda's pink coat, and told her she had not saved him with money, but with a question that had made the grown-ups ashamed of their silence. Matilda asked, looking up at him, whether he would ever have to sell his medal again. William smiled. "No, little soldier," he said. "This time someone is keeping watch." Zane took his daughter's hand, and the two of them walked out into the long, gentle light of the late afternoon.